Hi, I'm Joe Farrow and welcome to Geek Toolkit. In this episode, we're going to talk about how to install Home Assistant. Home Assistant is a great home automation setup. It's got a couple of quirks and we'll talk a little bit about them in this video. One of the quirks is there is, let's say, 3 different ways to install it that are the main ways, and then of those ways, there's a couple of different options for each one. So it can be a kind of a complex choose your own adventure path. What we need to do in this video is get you from that complexity down to something simple where you know how to decide which one's the right one, and then you can just get it installed. The way that we're going to accomplish that is by figuring out what matters to you most. And then after we know that, we can compare it to the different install types, and then you'll know how to make the decision. We're going to talk about 4 things and see how they matter to you. We'll talk about reliability, where your passions lie. Do you like user interfaces or not? And then what do you value more, time or money? The first thing I want to talk about is reliability. There's a couple of different types of users that are looking to install a home automation system. Some want to try out Home Assistant and see what does it look like? How does it work? Stuff like that. Some want to install it because they need to depend on it or they need a solution to a problem. They need it to work and they need it to be very reliable. So if you're installing this to just kind of experiment with it, I'll put you more on the experimenter path. It's a very simple path where you probably throw it on a Raspberry Pi, you can try it out. On the more complex path, but the more reliable path, we might look at something more like a VM or a Docker install or some kind of container install. So you have that reliability and you can do things like try out new versions and such, and we'll talk about those in a sec. The next one I'm going to talk about is passion. And what this passion is where do you want to spend your time? Are you more of an IT person where you have more fun there and that's where you want to spend it? Or are you more of like a tech enthusiast that wants to try out user scenarios? I'll explain a little bit about why this matters. There are some install options which require you to do things like understand the command lines of Linux and actually manage Docker containers on your own and stuff like that. And that's more of like an IT thing. But if you enjoy that or you know it and you're willing to maintain it yourself, then that might be a path you want to go on. On the other path are people that really, they want to install this, they want it to work, and they really are more excited about coming up with cool scenarios like having motion sensors turn their lights on, and they want to spend their time like tweaking that logic. And that's more of the enthusiast. It's not to mean that the person that does the IT backend stuff that's going to like map their network IP addresses to their MAC addresses, it doesn't mean that that person doesn't care about the automation. Again, this is all about what is more important to you and where do you want to spend your time, because the different install types definitely will put your time in different places. The next one I want to talk about is user interfaces. And this one's really simple. Do you like what's called a GUI or a graphical user interface, or do you like the command line? If you understand Linux and you know how to set up Samba and you're going to open up a COM file and that's how you're going to set up your network shares, then you're a command line person. That's great. If you don't know that, or if that's not how you prefer to do it, if you just want to right click on a user interface and say, I want a new share, then you're more of a GUI person, and that's great too. And we'll talk about options for both of those. Okay, now that we've gone through all that, let's start talking about install options. And then we'll match those to each of those things of reliability and time and GUI versus console and your passion. And then we can talk about, as I talk through those, you'll understand which one's right for you. Okay, the first install we're going to do is Raspberry Pi install. Now to go along with this guide, I gave you those 4 things that we would talk about for each install. Reliability wise, this isn't the most performant or reliable. A Raspberry Pi can get overwhelmed as your home automation system expands. So this is something that is okay to start out with, or if you want to try out this system. If you're serious about home automation and you have the cash up front to go with one of the different install options, I'd consider them over a Raspberry Pi. But if you just want to get started out or just try it, this might be a way to go. Passion-wise, this is going to be the easiest of installs, so it doesn't really matter what your passion is. This is going to get you up and running in no time. User interface wise, this is also super simple because this is going to give you a GUI based system that you can use for adding in components and so on. Value wise, it'll also be the best value. It's going to be the least expensive install option. Now, one little trade-off we can make for this is if you want to increase reliability and performance at the expense of value, you can install to a SSD drive instead of a micro SD card. This is very similar to anyone that uses a Raspberry Pi and does an SSD or a USB boot. Performance-wise, the SSD is going to be the best bang for the buck, and I'll link you to guides on how to basically boot off of an SSD. The install is the same as for an SSD as a USB drive, in that you're basically going to write a disk image to the device. Let's talk about SD cards real quick, because there's something very important here. The SD card specification has something called an A1 and an A2, and you can see that here on Amazon when I look at this disk. This one right here for $12 is an A1 disk, and this one here is an A2. They're both 64 gig SanDisk drives. This one is only $2 more US. But when we click here and we actually look at the performance of what an A2 drive is, we see that it's twice as fast on read speeds and 4 times as fast on write speeds. Home Assistant is constantly logging stuff to the disk, so this will give you quite a bit of a performance increase for that $2. You also get a bit of reliability, and it's how the Home Assistant site actually recommends doing an install. Now, speaking of the Home Assistant site, to actually install this to either a Raspberry Pi or to something that's similar like an Odroid, you're going to download these images. Simply click on this and you'll get a .img.gz file, which is a zipped up image. The next thing we're going to want to do is launch an app called Ballinet Etcher, and I'll link to the download for this. Ballinet Etcher looks like this, and it's very simple to use. You simply say you want to flash from a file, select the image.gz that you just downloaded, in this case the HassOS, select the target, which is going to be your microSD card. Now here you can see these say large drive, and then I have a 32 gig microSD card here, so I would just select that. And then I say flash, and this will go through and format the drive and do all of the stuff that's necessary for me. Okay, when you're done, you have to decide how you're going to network this. If you're just trying it out, you can use Wi-Fi. I highly do not recommend using Wi-Fi with Home Assistant for a number of reasons. One is, you're going to want this thing to have a reliable network connection. This goes back to reliability. And the simplest way to do that is to have it plugged into a router or something that's just hardwired. If you have to do Wi-Fi though, let me show you how to do it. It's a little quirky. You can't install this OS. You're not going to have a user interface that's going to really make it easy to configure it. So, and the other thing is, you would have to have a keyboard and mouse plugged into it. So if you want to actually have it connect to your Wi-Fi and do it all remotely, you're going to want to do this. Create a network folder. Inside of there, create a file called my-network. And then when you edit this file, use Notepad++ or Visual Studio Code or something like that. Do not use Notepad on Windows. Notepad will mess up the line endings, and your Raspberry Pi will ignore it, and you won't connect to the network. This file here I got from, if you're following the instructions on the Home Assistant site, it actually says copy one of these examples, which takes you to this page right here. And this has all of the different connection types that you would want to put into there. So you can say, okay, I want a wireless LAN. This is me. You copy this, paste it in. A couple things to know if you don't know this yet. SSID is the name of your wireless network. And then the PSK is your key. And this is where your password would go. You save that into this file here. You unplug the microSD card and you plug it into your Raspberry Pi, and then you turn your Raspberry Pi on and it would connect to the Wi-Fi network. However you do this, if you do it via that or if you plug it in, there's two things left to do. One is to find the Raspberry Pi to find out what the IP address is. The simplest way to do that is to go to homeassistant.local 8123. If you hit enter and you end up at this login page, congratulations, you're ready to go. It might look a little bit different because it might be the page where it's signing up for the account. If that doesn't work, here's two other ways to do it. One is to search for Adafruit Find My Pi, and what that will do is give you a thing like this. You can click on this and it will search your network and look for Raspberry Pis on your network, and then it can give you a list of what it finds. When it's done, if it finds something, you'll get a page like this, which will have the IP address of the Raspberry Pi. One of the challenges about this technique is if you have more than one Raspberry Pi on here, you're probably not going to find what you're looking for because it will find the first Pi, but it won't find the others on your network. At least it hasn't for me. Another technique is to use an IP scanner. This one's called Advanced IP Scanner, and you can see here it found Home Assistant at 180, which is the one I want. If you navigate to the IP address that it finds and you go to :8123 and hit enter, you should end up at a login page like this. And then you'll know that you found your Home Assistant and you're ready for the next part of the setup. Before we get into the next couple of installs, it's going to be important to understand what are the components that make up Home Assistant, because these other installs don't necessarily have all of these components. The first thing that we want to talk about is HasOS, which is a proprietary Linux OS that is very stripped down. It doesn't have a shell or anything. It's got a couple of commands in it that will help you control Home Assistant, and it also manages its own updates and everything. There's Home Assistant Core, which is the user interface on Home Assistant that will give you things like the ability to create automations, what's called the Lovelace dashboard, which is like your user interface, and so on. Then the really important one is the add-on store, and the add-on store allows you to very easily add things into Home Assistant. Finally, the other thing this allows you to do is have an updater so that you can actually click an update button in the UI and have it go out and get an update and pull it back down for you. So that is what Home Assistant is. It's a whole bunch of different components that work together. Install I want to talk about next is called the Home Assistant Core install, or also known as the Virtual Environment or VM install. When we look at our personas, this is going to give you a bonus to reliability and performance because you can put this on any Linux hardware that's able to run an OS and then run Python. It's going to be more of an IT manager persona because you're going to have to manage things like OS updates on your own. You're going to have to manage your own Docker containers, and you're going to spend a lot more time in the console. If you want to do an add-on, like say you want to configure Samba on the device, you basically would do it the same way you would do in Linux, where you go apt-get Samba and you configure the COM files. You do that from the command line, and then you would have to point Home Assistant to any add-on that you configured in that way to make things work together. So for Samba, you'd have to point it at the shares. Now, if you're familiar with doing your own Docker containers and you have a very specific Linux machine you want to put it on, or maybe you have a Linux machine that does other tasks like a web server, then this might be the install for you. The next install we're going to talk about is a supervised install. A supervised install is interesting, and it has a little bit of history I want to get into real quick. Supervised install used to be the way to install Home Assistant for somebody that was a little bit more advanced, because what it would do is allow you to put a Home Assistant on any machine, any OS, with anything you wanted running on it, and you would have the add-on store and the updater and all of that as well. Downside, though, is that the Home Assistant team, for very good and obvious reasons, could not support this. There were just too many different variables introduced by this. So a supervised install today, when you look at the website, the first things for the install is you're going to have to set up Docker on your own and configure it, because you're basically putting Home Assistant in Docker. You've got to set up all of the components and requirements on your own, and they have to match these versions here. Also, looking at additional supported conditions, there's a couple really important ones to understand here. To stay in support, no software outside of the Home Assistant ecosystem is installed. So this means if you go ahead and install a web server on there and it screws up the web server that Home Assistant is using, then you're out of support to try to get help. I would read this document very carefully. The security OS updates are going to be responsible by you. So if you want to keep your home automation stuff updated, you're going to be managing the Linux machine. It is similar to the virtual environment in that space, and that's why I say this is more of a advanced install where you're going to want to know what you're doing. Okay, the final install I want to talk about, and the one that I've fallen in love with recently, is virtual machines. Virtual machines are host software on a computer that allows you to run little virtual computers inside of it. What it does, though, is it takes some of the resources away from the main machine to run these little computers, but it allows you to run more than one computer at a time. I'll give you an example. Say you have a computer with a 128 gig hard drive, 8 gigs of RAM, and a 4-core processor. Not a super beefy machine by any means, but much, much more beefy than a Raspberry Pi. On there, I can have a computer that has 1 core, maybe 2 gigs of RAM, and 32 gigs of hard drive space, which is very close to what a Raspberry Pi does, and I can run Home Assistant in there as a virtual machine. As far as that virtual computer knows, it is, the equivalent of everything that would be running on any Linux device, including a Raspberry Pi. It's got its own hard drive space, its own memory, and so on. I also have a bunch of resources left over. I've got, 6 more gigs of RAM and quite a bit of hard drive space. I can go take another core or so and assign it to a second computer, and on that computer I could be running Windows if I wanted, or I could be running Kali Linux, which is a security software. And if I really have a beefier machine, I can run multiple of these all the time. The other cool thing about virtual machines is they only take up resources when they're running. Home Assistant's meant to run all the time, so I would write off whatever I assign to that. But if I'm running Kali Linux and I shut it down, I could fire up a Windows virtual machine, use Windows for a while, decide I want to go, run some programming in Linux. I can shut that down, run a Linux virtual machine that has all my programming software on it, and run that for a while. I could also run, secondary virtual machines that do things like security camera processing or like a Plex media server and so on. So there's a lot of like specialized computers that I could have running. Now, when we talk about reliability of a home automation system, if I have a virtual computer that I can clone, which is very easy with a virtual machine, that makes things really cool. Because say I want to understand, what is this update going to do to my home? I can clone my virtual machine and then I can update just the second virtual machine and see how things go. If they go horribly, I can just throw that virtual machine out. It's like deleting a file, and then I'm right back up to my working setup. And if things go great, then I can just move to that virtual machine and delete the old one. So it makes it very easy to test out upgrades or to back up a virtual machine. Also, I can just basically save off the file and have a perfectly caught in time, they call it a snapshot of where I was at that time. Okay, now we're going to talk about virtual machines. I'm going to walk you through my setup, which is an Unraid based setup, but Proxmox, ESXI, FreeNAS are going to be very similar in a lot of ways. I do like Unraid. It does cost money, but it gives me a really friendly GUI, and we'll talk about that in a second. First thing I want to talk about is what hardware I'm running on. I'm actually running on an Intel NUC, NUC, it stands for Next Unit Computing. And here's one I just found on eBay that I looked for the same model I have, which is this model here, which is a bit older model. I think it's from 2013 or so. But it's about the same setup I have it. I have 8 gigs of RAM. I have a 120 gig SSD. I actually got it without an OS, which is nice. You don't need an OS because you're going to put your own on there anyway. Operating system I'm using is called Unraid, and Unraid is a host OS for virtual machines. It also does all the network attached storage and a bunch of other things. It's very interesting the way this installed. You download an EXE, you run the EXE, and it creates a USB drive. You plug it in your device and boot off that USB drive, and it runs off the USB drive. It actually, in the licensing, it licenses itself to that USB drive, so it locks itself there. It is, like I said, paid software. It's one-time fees. It's an interesting license. It's how many hard drives you have plugged into it. After booting off the USB device, you can navigate on any other computer and get this beautiful dashboard to manage Unraid. This will tell you things about how your CPU usage and all that is, and this UI basically manages the entire server. If you want to set up shares, very simple. There's a UI for that. If I want to understand any of these here, I can click and I get a help that's right there in line that tells me what these settings are. But basically I've given it that server name. I say add share. And I'm going to bring up the shares here. This is my server called Tower. It's already there. It went up there faster than I could hit refresh. There's my share ready to go. If I want to lock it down, I can go down here and I can fill in this. If I want to create users, I can create them here. So it's a very, again, visual graphic user interface, a GUI-based system. The other thing I like about this is there's an app store in here, and this app store is incredibly powerful. It has a ton of things. You can see stuff here like game servers and so on. If I want to set up a Minecraft server, I'm sure there, oh wow, there's all sorts of servers. I can just, basically, let's see. Yeah, oh, there's tons of Minecraft servers, of course. I can have this machine do a ton of other things besides the Home Assistant, and it has the power to do them. So now we've set up a share, I can set up my network attached storage, but really what we're here to do is install Home Assistant. So let's talk about that. What you want to do is go to the same Home Assistant page I'll link to. This is where we got our Raspberry Pi images. And what we're going to do is click down in this section that says Virtual Appliances. Now for Unraid, you're going to want a QCOW2. And when you click and download that, you'll see it has a .gz extension. Now this is a gzip extension. This is not the file format we need. We're going to have to extract it. What I'm going to do with that is once it's downloaded, I will copy that to my server, or I can extract it, and basically I will end up with a .QCOW2 extension. Now I put this in a folder called HA under domains, and once that file's there, that's basically your hard drive for Home Assistant all set up for you. So now's all we have to do is set up the virtual machine and point the hard drive for it at this file. I'll show you how easy that is, and I think this will make sense once you see it. Here's the virtual machine UI on Unraid. We're back in Unraid again. I'm going to say add VM virtual machine. You can say add Windows machines. Like Home Assistant is Debian based, so I'm going to say a new Debian machine. I'll want it to auto start when we start up here, and I'll give it a name, Home Assistant. I gotta be careful, this is gonna be my actual install here that I'm doing. So I'm gonna give it 3 gigs of RAM, and I will say that it can take up to 4 gigs of RAM if needed. I noticed Home Assistant actually does, when I give it 3 gigs of RAM, it actually does use a bit more than 2 gigs. And so I'm gonna give it a little bit of headroom there so it has some space. This right here, the CPU cores, I can actually say I wanna use all 4 cores if I want to go really quick. but I'm going to just use one. It doesn't need a lot of CPU from my experience, but if it does later, I can always add to this virtual machine and upgrade it. Now we're going to go down to this part here, and this is where we're going to point the disk at what we have. See where it says primary vdisk location? This is my virtual disk. And I'm going to say manual. And under user here, under domains where I put this in the HA folder, I should see that hard drive. So I'm going to select that QCOW2 file. That's my hard drive. I'll leave all these alone. I'll leave VNC set up there. I don't need sound, so I won't set that up. Network bridge, I'll leave there. Now this right here is important. This is what's called a pass-through. And what happens is when you plug a USB device into your computer, the virtual machine has a way of accessing the actual physical devices if you pass it through. Now I have a Z-Wave dongle that is this device here, and so I'm going to click on that, and this is how you get the USB things you plug in to be able to be visible by Home Assistant. I want it to start after creation, so I'm going to say create, and that's it. I've basically set up a machine with Home Assistant. You can see it's started, and the only thing about this UI that was a little bit tricky for me is you want to click on the icon here. This is a Debian icon. You want to click on that to be able to do things like stop it, start it, and so on, force stop or whatever. Okay, so the first thing you want to do that I failed to do when I first filmed this is let it sit for 15 to 20 minutes so that it updates. If you end up at a login prompt, you'll want to just type root and hit enter, and you'll end up at this prompt here. And then you want to type network info, and this IP address is what I'm looking for here, this 192.168.1.169. Okay, let's go to that IP address and see what we get. 192.168.1.169:8123. Boom. Home Assistant is up and running in my virtual machine with 3 gigs of RAM, and I have a whole bunch of other stuff I can do. That's it. That is Home Assistant installed as a virtual machine. Now again, Proxmox is going to be very similar. The network shares are a bit harder with Proxmox. In my opinion, you have to set up Samba from the command line. But if you're a command line person, then Proxmox is free and you can have fun with that. FreeNAS is out there. I haven't tried that one. ESXI I haven't tried, but you should be aware of all the options and you can research them and figure out which one's right for you. At the end of the day, the one thing I want you to take away from this video is based on who you are and what you know and what you're comfortable with and how you want to use that. When you put all that together, there are several different ways to install Home Assistant, and hopefully I've shown you one that is right for you. Please check the description of this video. I'm going to put a bunch of links in there and I'll keep updating them. I also, in the description, will put updates because things move so fast. On my last Home Assistant install, I had to update it 3 different times because of how brutal the changes were. So that will be very helpful for you if you hit any issues or something to read. I would honestly suggest reading it before starting. That way you're aware of the latest info. And I try to be really good about keeping those updated on my videos. Again, I want to thank you for watching. I know this was a bit long, but hopefully this covered everything you would want to know on installs. And then I will make a video from here of, okay, once you have this installed, what do you do next? And then we'll just create a little series that will hopefully be a good beginner's guide to Home Assistant. Thanks for everything. I'll talk to you soon.